Chapter 11: George W. Bush's Quest for Realignment. Realignment. By the 70s and 80s, Republican strategists wanted realignment. Liberals had control of the Congress, presidency, and the Supreme Court for 3 decades. Republicans wanted to take the government back. If the same party controls both the Senate and the House and the presidency, that party has incredible power. The president will most likely be able to complete most of his agenda, and the opposite party's proposals will likely not be scheduled for hearing or even discussed. Bush grew up in a wealthy home in Texas where his father was a successful oilman, and he was raised around conservative values from an early age. He grew up to believe that voluntary organizations, church charities, and individualism could solve most social problems. He also thought that the 1960s had corrupted American values by sparking the drug culture, liberal ideology, and secularism. Bush was an alcoholic periodically from 1970 to 1980 before he quit cold turkey in 1986 because he felt that it was getting in the way of his ambitious goals. He sought governorship of Texas as a gateway into the presidency. Some of Bush's ambitious goals included returning the U.S. to the values and policies of the late 19th century when churches dominated social welfare. Bush believed that God intended him to restore traditional Christian values into America. He wanted to move the nation in a more conservative direction. He also wanted to downsize the federal government and turn many programs from the federal government's responsibility to the states. He supported Reagan's following ideas: trickle-down economy, which gives the wealthy and corporations large tax cuts in order to stimulate job-creating investments; depletion of government resources that might otherwise be used to support government programs and liberal reforms; and sizable increase in military spending. Bush was also considered a compassionate conservative because he included educational reforms in his plans. Bush campaigned for the governor of Texas by emphasizing 4 issues: create local control of schools, trying juvenile defenders as adults, reducing the roles of welfare, and limiting damage awards and liability suits. He also used negative tactics in order to campaign by suggesting that Richards had close connections with the LGBTQ community, and also suggested that she would take away gun rights in states where most citizens owned guns and opposed gun control laws. He demonstrated the skills to work with Democrats when necessary. The presidential campaign of 2000. Bush appealed to conservatives by pledging a huge tax cut totaling $1.3 trillion to be spread over 10 years, and wanting to privatize Social Security by allowing workers to invest some payroll tax funds into the stock market. He appealed to moderates by arguing he was a compassionate conservative, said that he would support some increases in federal aid, and limit prescription drugs for Medicare recipients. He appealed to Democrats by portraying himself as a family man that could unite the nation, and appealed to Christian fundamentalists by supporting school prayer, promising government assistance to faith-based organizations that helped welfare mothers, ex-prisoners, and addicts, and opposing partial birth abortions. This election ended up being a cliffhanger that depended on the votes from Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Fortunately for Bush, his brother Jeb was Florida's governor. Jeb controlled the state's electoral apparatus and the Republican legislature. Bush versus Gore voters. Bush had more religious voters, primarily wealthy white people and blue-collar voters, mostly male, and they tended to be pro-life, anti-gun control, and opposed many environmental policies. Gore had 61% of non-religious voters. African American and Hispanic people primarily voted for Gore, and mostly females. These 2 types of voters seemed to split the country into 2 Americas, which differed a great deal in their values and policy views. Swing voters tended to include soccer moms, as the book called them. These are suburban mothers who want to expand social programs, including child care, but also leaned more conservative fiscally. Bush's domestic policies. Bush's tax cut proposal was $1.7 trillion. Almost 40% of the tax cut would benefit the wealthiest 1% of the U.S. The tax cut was enacted, but it was reduced to $1.35 trillion. Bush invested far more political resources in his tax cut than he did any other domestic policy in his first 3 years of presidency. This tax cut would increase economic inequality even further, and it would reduce funds that supported schools, Medicare prescription drugs, and other social services. Republican moderates pressured Bush to increase educational funds by several billion dollars. The Bush administration. They showed favoritism towards religious organizations and possessed a sort of private market fundamentalism. Bush proposed that public funds should go to religious organizations whether or not they attempted to create social welfare programs. They created a White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in 2001. September 11, 2001. 2 hijacked planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Another crashed into the Pentagon, and a 4th plane was on track to strike either the White House or the Capitol building, but then crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. This terrorist act was conducted by Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden ran to Afghanistan, where he was protected by the Taliban. Bush declared a war on terrorism. Congress gave Bush the clear to attack and defeat the Taliban, any terrorist forces in the world, and any nation that harbored terrorist groups. He ordered a massive bombing on Afghanistan that ended up with troops on the ground there. Bush told citizens not to discriminate against Muslims and that hate crimes would not be tolerated. However, many people felt that the Justice Department was incarcerating Muslims without formal charges, denying them legal counsel, and depriving them of their basic rights. Additionally, immigration tightened, specifically from countries in the Middle East. In January 2002, Bush's educational proposal called the No Child Left Behind Act was enacted. This increased federal subsidies to schools by $11 billion. However, it did not establish vouchers. It required states to either use existing standardized tests or to develop new standardized tests, which measures students' proficiency in reading and math. If school scores failed to improve, the school would be put on notice by the state. If they continued to show no improvement, the schools might be shut down. Critics feared teachers would teach to tests rather than enhancing students' critical thinking and overall learning. It was later revealed that Bush requested billions of dollars less than what the Congress had authorized to be subsidized to schools. The stock market collapse created a financial challenge for many states. Declining revenues and increasing counterterrorism expenses along the stock market crash forced many states to cut spending on social programs and education. Some corporations, such as Enron, WorldCom, and Global Crossing, used fraudulent accounts to lie about their profits in order to keep their stock prices high in the 90s. Bush shifted his political agenda to focus on issues abroad. He abruptly shifted his agenda from domestic concerns to terrorism and war. Bush told Iraq to immediately disclose the location of their biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons of mass destruction. There was no apparent reason why Bush focused on Iraq in mid-2002. There was no evidence that had surfaced that linked Hussein to al-Qaeda. The UN supposedly had found weapons of mass destruction before being kicked out of Iraq. Iraq remained a weak nation from strict trade sanctions placed on the UN after Desert Storm, and many children were starving because Iraq lacked proper food. Additionally, Iraq was only allowed to export enough oil to secure funds for food, drugs, and basic survival needs. Basically, Iraq was not an apparent threat to the U.S., yet Bush was convinced that they were a threat. So why did Bush wage a war on Iraq then? It is presumed that Bush decided to do this for political reasons. Congressional elections were coming up and Republican prospects were declining. Bush wanted to seem like the hero for the country by creating a threat to the U.S. even when there wasn't one. Saddam Hussein also had hired assassins to kill George H.W. Bush, George Bush's father, in the late 1990s, but they were unsuccessful. He wanted to get back at him. Preemptive strikes. The new foreign policy issued in September 2002 said, While the United States will constantly strive to enlist the support of the international community, we will not hesitate to act alone, if necessary, to exercise our right of self-defense by acting preemptively against such terrorists. But wouldn't other nations initiate action against countries that they suspect might attack them? The concept of preemptive strikes would threaten international order. Other countries, specifically Middle Eastern countries, would then view the U.S. as the aggressor. The Bush administration had not revealed enough convincing evidence that Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Bush gave Hussein an ultimatum: disclose the locations for all Iraq's previously owned or currently owned weapons of mass destruction and let the UN inspect or be attacked. Hussein was vague about whether or not he destroyed previously discovered weapons of mass destruction. Bush then shifted the agenda from the economy and domestic problems to Iraq. Inspectors couldn't find any weapons of mass destruction, but Bush insisted that Hussein's refusal to account for his weapons meant that he had them. Criticism of Bush's decisions escalated not only in the U.S. but all around the world. Colin Powell testified in front of the United Nations that an African country was exporting materials to Iraq that were used to make uranium. This was later discovered to be false. Intelligence officers warned the U.S. that interference with Iraq would assist al-Qaeda in recruiting thousands of new terrorists, because American occupation of any Arab nation would be portrayed as offensive and imperialistic in Arab culture. Taking down Hussein could instigate a civil war in Iraq between their tribes. American invasion might worsen the situation in the Middle East, as well as cause high death tolls for both American and Iraqi troops. Only about 40% of voters believed that the U.S. had done the right thing by taking military action with Iraq. A solid majority of the public believed that the Bush administration had lied to get the public to support the invasion of Iraq, such as alleging links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda that were later found to not exist. A majority of the public believed that the Iraq War made the United States even more vulnerable against terrorist attacks by stimulating the growth of terrorist organizations in the Middle East. Bush's efforts domestically and abroad. Bush became the first president to provide major funding for the AIDS epidemic in Africa, granting $10 billion initially with a promise of $30 billion to follow in 2007. About 40% of the citizens in some African countries have AIDS or were HIV positive. Bush deserves credit for promising to raise the American foreign aid from 1% GDP to 1.5% by 2006. However, European countries pledged to expand far more rapidly and at a base much higher than the U.S. Environmental issues had become increasingly important. Bush decided not to sign the Kyoto Agreement, in which many nations pledged to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to slow global warming. Environmentalists blamed the Bush administration for loosening clean air standards. Bush supported drilling for oil in Alaska, loosened lodging restrictions in national forests, allowed higher levels of arsenic in drinking water, eased deadlines for raising pollution standards for cars, and granted snowmobile access to the Yellowstone National Park. Domestic agenda in 2003 and 2004. There was a proposed additional $700 billion multi-year tax cut, which liberal critics argued it would only benefit the nation's top 10% wealthiest individuals and that it would lead to huge deficits. Bush had tax cuts by almost $1.7 trillion spread over 10 years. He increased military spending from $250 billion to $400 billion a year, and devoted $700 billion a year to counterterrorism. Basically, $3.4 trillion was taken from the government spending that could have been used for domestic programs. Hurricane Katrina. A hurricane hit New Orleans and the Gulf Coast in August of 2005 that was probably the most destructive natural disaster in the nation's history. Bush did not respond appropriately to this natural disaster at all. His popularity plummeted as a result, allowing Democrats to make a major electoral gain in 2006. Voters in the 2006 congressional elections would criticize Bush for his slow response to Hurricane Katrina. Congressional election of 2006. This was a transformational election, meaning that one party's dominance would be challenged. The Democrats won a victory in this election because more than 60% of Americans thought the invasion of Iraq was a mistake, as well as Bush's response to Hurricane Katrina being too slow. Effects of the Iraq War. The Iraq War swayed voters in the 2006 congressional elections. Additionally, voters' perceptions of the Iraq War would then determine the 2008 elections for presidency. More Democrats were in tune with the adverse public opinion about the Iraq War than were the Republicans.